Good evening. You might think that the order of these two lectures was perhaps reversed, because one could say that improvising is to composing as running is to walking. There are no opportunities for corrections when you improvise. But I think it's rather revealing that Mozart and Beethoven and those of this age who did improvise in public were wont to improvise variations, free fantasies, and preludes. They were not wont to improvise sonatas, for instance. It's true that in the Baroque, virtuosi would attempt to improvise fugues, and people of Bach's level succeeded brilliantly in so doing. But the art of extempore playing was by definition less rigorous. You could, in improvising a cadenza, do a deconstruction of the tunes and the progressions and the content of the foregoing piece. But it would not aspire, should we say, to architectural rigor, although it is true that Mozart's cadenzas to his piano concertos do follow a structural mold, which one could discuss. I am proposing, thus, to go to a more rigorous contemplation of Mozart's language in terms of both his brogue and in terms of his architecture. And I'd like to start by posing a bit of a riddle for you, so as to get you involved creatively in judging these sorts of things. And if we could have the second slide, please. What you will see here is a piece I think that quite a few of you know. This is a piece that does not have a manuscript anymore. It was published after Mozart's death as Minuet by W.A. Mozart with Trio by Maximilian Stadler. Those of you who are familiar with the details of Mozart's legacy will know that Maximilian Stadler, who was a court counselor, helped Mozart's widow Constanze in the ordering of the musical estate, in conjunction with which he labeled fragmentary pieces, tried to bring stray leaves together with the works to which they belonged, and in certain cases completed fragments of Mozart to give Constanze yet a few more pieces that could be marketed. Now, as we have just heard, this minuet was published under the title Minuet by W.A. Mozart with Trio by Maximilian Stadler. This minuet has a celebrity which extends beyond its small shape. Indeed, Tchaikovsky, in his fourth orchestral suite, Mozartiana, orchestrates this minuet. Now, I'm going to play it for you. But before I do, I am intentionally seeking to arouse your suspicions about this piece. If indeed it was published as a minuet by Mozart with Trio by Stadler, did Mozart write the entirety of this minuet? Did Stadler provide the trio, which, by the way, is not Mozartian in sound at all? Doesn't sound at all like Mozart. Stadler often did better. But is Stadler's intervention here not merely to add the alter ego of a trio to a minuet? Did he, in fact, not find a fragment which he completed and supplied with the trio? Now, you could say there is no way of knowing that unless Mozart's autograph were to turn up one day. But I think it's interesting to pose the question, because to pose the question is to start to ask you to delve into the stylistic integrity of this piece and see from what you derive from it what the issues are that emerge when one tries to complete a piece which is most definitely not finished. So let's have a listen to this rather famous chromatic minuet, and I'd like you to keep your ears open for any kind of suspicious activity. I shall, in the interests of brevity, not play the repeats. rather striking piece, I think we'll all agree, and certainly has some audacity in both its voice leading and its chromatic harmony. Are your suspicions aroused by this, or do you accept it as delivered by Stadler as a minuet by Mozart? And if you are suspicious, can you localize the moment where the suspicion arises? There it is in front of you. I don't know if you can read the bar numbers. So would someone like to venture a judgment about this? Yes.
You wouldn't have those dissonances on the first beats with those.
You mean in the beginning of the second half? On the second line. You mean here? Well, if in fact you discredit Mozart's authorship as quickly as the fifth bar of the piece, then there really isn't very much to talk about. In fact, I think if the manuscript of Mozart broke off, I doubt that Stadler would have tried his hand at it. Because I think most people who complete fragments don't complete pieces which don't have at least a minimal viability. For instance, the original version of the second movement of the C minor piano concerto is this. I mean, obviously. But the fact that Mozart stopped before even that most obvious chord shows that he decided, no, this won't do. So I would say that whatever stylistic objections you might raise to the augmented triad, and it is rather extravagant, I would say that the syllogism of Stadler's completion suggests that he had more at his disposal than that. Why don't I give up the riddle for a moment and tell you what I think, and more importantly, why. You'll notice, if you accept the so-called development section for what it is, that when Mozart returns to the main subject of the minuet, instead of as at the beginning, we notice he goes This certainly shows an inquisitive mind at work, and therefore if I were apt to discredit Mozart as the author of part of this minuet, I would be likely to include the recapitulation of that tune within the part that he wrote. But let us cast our attention on what happens immediately after that phrase. The first time we hear it, the bass line moves quite logically through the outline of the dominant seventh chord to the tonic. This in itself is totally unremarkable. What's remarkable is that instead of we get, which is really quite provocative. Now look what happens the second time if you look at the end of the right column, first line going onwards. There's something about that that doesn't quite smell right. You see, you can go you can do all of those things, but it just doesn't seem quite habile. And then one starts to think, wait a minute, let's look at the rest of this minuet. Well, the rest of it is simply an upward transposition of So you could easily imagine Stadler deciding that the way he was going to finish this minuet was simply to transpose the first half, which runs to the dominant A major, down a fifth, and therefore it would end in the proper key of D major, and all he had to do was find the link. And the link that he settled on is not terribly convincing. So this leads to a much more interesting question, which is why I chose this piece to begin this lecture. If indeed Mozart stopped writing his minuet down at this very moment, why did he stop there? As you can see, he was only 3 lines from completing the minuet. It wouldn't have taken him much time. Now, I am not the first person to suggest that this minuet was a fragment and that Stadler had a hand in it. That honor goes to a theoretician, very famous one, Ernst Oster, who is a luminary in the world of Schenker analysis. He promulgated the idea that Mozart gave up the minuet at this point because he couldn't think of a satisfactory, acceptable, plausible, good ending, and so he abandoned it. All honor to Ernst Oster, but that's not how Mozart works, and it's not the way he thinks. Mozart doesn't give up on a piece 70% of the way through because he suddenly discovers it's not going to work. If it weren't going to work, he would never have written this much of it, and in the case of a minuet, he probably wouldn't have put the first note on the page. A symphony maybe, but not a minuet. No, no, no. The reason that Mozart must have stopped writing the piece at this point was that the ending was so entirely obvious that it was superfluous to notate it at the moment. He could always come back to it at any point in the future and know exactly what he intended. Now, the fact that it was perfectly obvious to Mozart but not obvious to Stadler is intriguing. Why didn't Stadler see it? And what is it that he did not see? As we go back to the beginning of the minuet, with its little coda, what we observe after the first 4 bars is a sequence, and this sequence leads, despite the oddness of the harmonies, it leads quite persuasively to the dominant of A major. So, at first glance, it doesn't seem like there's anything about that sequential passage which allows itself to be deconstructed in a satisfactory way as to explain what was obvious to Mozart and what impelled him or permitted him to cease work on this composition. But that's only at first glance. If you examine the sequence carefully, you will realize that it starts with an augmented triad built on D, then repeats it a whole step lower, at which point it does not continue the sequence literally, but jumps upward a 4th, and it is that jump which secures A major. So what would happen if Mozart, in fact, did not inflect the sequence after one iteration, but simply symmetrically continued the trajectory defined by the second iteration? Then we would get and he would be exactly where he needed to be. So that must be the solution, except for one thing. The dramatic leap upwards in the first half would be sorely missed. It would seem, after having heard hearing merely it would seem somehow undramatic. So somehow that leap needs to be preserved, but it's not terribly difficult to do it. which leaves a minor problem to be solved. The first time around, from the fifth of the chord, and then the third of the chord. Unfortunately, if Mozart does that literally, it ends rather low, and that does not seem very satisfactory. That is why Stadler, as you can see, changed it to. He had intuition good enough to realize that he needed to end in the upper octave. But in doing what he did, he takes Mozart's version, which is fifth, third, and root, which is highly satisfactory, and changes it to, in this case, the fifth, and then just the root, which is somewhat disappointing. When Mozart is confronted with these kinds of registral problems of something that would otherwise run off the keyboard, he always solves it by recasting the passage. And you can recast it by using an inversion of direction. So, and that may be the solution to the riddle. But I present this to you as a preface for seeing that a document like this, murky as it is, without the manuscript to document the place at which his creative energies ceased, one can still philologically plunge into the content of the piece and start to speculate and maybe even reach some persuasive solutions about these things. Now, tomorrow's concert is going to feature the two piano wind quintets of Mozart and Beethoven, the Beethoven honoring and being based on his admiration for the Mozart. And each one of these quintets will be prefaced by a sonata movement by Mozart, and both of them are fragments, and both of them will be presented with completions which I have prepared. But I want to prepare you to listen to those completions, not by playing them now, because there's no need to do that, but I'd like you to listen to some alternative versions of those and see why it was that I returned to these pieces and proposed alternatives. You see, I said a moment ago that people did not improvise sonatas. But Mozart, when he writes a sonata movement and comes back to the recapitulation, very, very rarely presents the same material in the same order as it was heard in the exposition. His creative energy is far too restless for that. On the other hand, a completer like Maximilian Stadler, when completing a sonata movement like that, tries to do as little as possible. And so he almost unfailingly presents exactly what we heard before, with the result of which there are no surprises. Nothing is un-Mozartian, but it fails the basic creative test of being too routine. In the case of the G minor sonata movement, and here we can go to slide number 4, please. I have not here given you the score of the entirety of this sonata movement. I have started just before Mozart's manuscript breaks off, and it's rather interesting that two hands were involved in the completion of this piece. The first person simply took it from the break-off point to the recapitulation and stopped, and somebody else wrote out the recapitulation. So many cooks perhaps spoiling the broth. In this case, what I'd like to do is to play for you the fragment and stop where Mozart stops, which is, as it turns out, the second bar of this page. So you'll have to wait a little bit before it comes, but I shall give you good warning. And again, I shall omit the repeat of the exposition. It's quite a portentous moment to break off, and I think we can all agree that if Mozart stopped notating this piece, it was not because it was of inferior quality. And indeed, the allegation that is made by some people that Mozart stopped writing pieces because they were second-rate was definitively belied by the researches of Alan Tyson, who showed by studying the paper types on which Mozart wrote his pieces that many of his famous completed works were fragments for as many as 10 years, and then he took them up and carried them forward. So a piece like this G minor sonata gives you an idea of what Mozart's music in 1792 or 1793 might have sounded like. Now, I'd like to proceed with a performance of the rest of this movement in the standard version that you're apt to find in most publications. And I better get rid of this. So I will start a couple of bars before this so you're prepared for it and cue it for you. There we are. Next slide, please. Now, it's not an implausible completion. The recapitulation does what a recapitulation should do, and perhaps those pianissimo chords at the end were a genial idea of rounding the movement off. But I think if you start to look at the creative element in this completion, it becomes clear that the more you look at it, the more wanting certain details are. For instance, when one arrives at the moment just before the recapitulation, this is a moment when the tension in the music needs to grow. If you want to think about one of the most masterful of such places, think about the end of the development of the Beethoven Pathetique sonata that you have. I mean, it's a Hitchcock movie. I mean, the sweat on the brow, the tension, these unbelievable sounds. It's almost supernatural what's going on there, and the sense of dread, and how long it takes the second time. We watch in this fascination of horror as the piece, like a plane which is about to crash, just goes, head over toes. And it is a very, very important thing to prepare the audience for that moment of structural inevitability. Because, of course, the beginning of a recapitulation in a sonata is equivalent in the great Aristotelian model, followed by Shakespeare, of the moment of self-recognition. It is when finally the scales are from your eyes and you realize either what your tragic destiny is when Hamlet leaps into the grave, or through the absurdity of your position, you realize that you've been duped or fooled. And what's amazing is that masterpieces of comedy and tragedy follow the same mold, and it works equally well, just as sonata form works just as well for joy and for tragedy. But if you think again about this passage, happens rather too quickly. You barely arrive at the existential question, and the answer is blurted out. Now, if we go on, we have to see that in the passage of triplets, which you see part of here, we could go back a slide if that's possible. Right, and you see at the bottom the transition, which the first time around, having arrived on the dominant of B flat, he then uses a passage in triplets to go. And so this composer realizes that he has to do something similar. So he has to get to the dominant of G minor, and then he will go up this cycle of sixth chords. But let's listen to the details of how he does it. How awkward it is for him to stub his toe and repeat that G, right? Mozart didn't do that. Also notice how cleverly Mozart starts with a complete bar of triplets. Then he leaves out the first beat. Then there's this swirl of continuous motion, which launches us towards the structural articulation. He's a master of psychology, and he uses the manipulation of the rhythmic surface to achieve structural architectural goals. What does this person do? And the last one is especially strange, because instead of the leading tone to the dominant on the bottom, which would be much stronger, he uses the submedian, the sixth degree of the scale, and the figure is tautological. So he does what is necessary structurally, but with a minimum of competence. Then we start to go up the scale, and we think Mozart So Mozart ascends in a steady direction, reaches the E flat, and deliberately repeats it to announce to you that he's about to turn the corner. This person, on the other hand, next page, please. So the top note is this, then it's this, then it's this, and then it's that again. So on a level of craftsmanship, this is clearly wanting. Finally, at the end of the piece, where Mozart in B flat major has first it's 5 of B flat. Then it's 5 of the second degree of the scale. This is a progression which works impeccably in major, in the major mode, and is used by Beethoven over and over and over again. But when you're in the minor mode, it doesn't work because, unfortunately, the second degree of the scale is diminished. It's not capable of bearing harmonic solid weight. And so when this person goes, he's pulling in both directions. He's pulling towards A major in the sharp direction, and then pulling, on the other hand, towards G minor in the flat direction, and it's incoherent. So, of course, just because you can tell a good egg from a bad egg doesn't mean that you can lay one. I'm quite aware of that. But if you come tomorrow night, you will hear an alternative version of this piece. And in particular, what you will also hear is what happens when one remembers that Mozart is loath to repeat the events in the exact same order as he did in the exposition. There will always be surprises. So in this piece and in the Sophia Constanze movement, and it's called that because Mozart writes above a sighing figure, Sophia Constanze, obviously a moment of domestic cheerfulness, Constanze being his future wife and Sophie being one of her sisters. I would say that if you listen to these pieces, you sometimes might agree with Georges de Saint-Foy, who said that often the fragments of Mozart were the most beautiful pieces he had ever written. They're often also the most experimental. And it is close to inexplicable at certain times that he placed the priority on finishing other pieces rather than some of these. Now, I'm going to jump from here to a problem vast in scope by comparison with these relatively harmless sonata movements, and what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my lecture are the problems involved in attempting to complete the C minor Mass. Now, it would take the rest of the lecture time to outline just the historical details and the state of the sources. So I'm not going to talk about any of those things. If you want to ask questions later, we can delve with those. What matters for the purposes right now is simply to consider what survives of this Mass so that you can understand what the problems are that are involved in attempting a completion of it. Whether it's a legitimate activity is another matter altogether. When Mozart started to work on the C minor Mass, he used standard Viennese 12-stave paper. If we can go now to slide number 11, please. And this is the opening leaf of the C minor Mass. You will notice that although Mozart did not finish this piece, he signs it, Die Wolfgango Amadeo Mozart, 1783. And he numbers the pages. You see the one with his characteristic notation with a dot over the one. And below that it says Eigene Handschrift, his own handwriting. That was written by Nissen, who became Constanze Mozart's second husband and who wrote one of the early biographies of Mozart's life. And then underneath that in red ink, you can't tell this, but it is in red ink, Ist zum Davide penitente umgearbeitet. And this was Heinrich Henkel, who noted that Mozart created an oratorio, a cantata, in which, in a device known as contrafactura, an Italian text was retrofitted to the music of the Kyrie and the Gloria of the Mass. This is a fact to which I shall return. The number 145 down the right margin is the number that this piece occupies in a catalog of Mozart manuscripts that was prepared for Johann Anton Andre, who bought all of the Mozart manuscripts that Constanze still owned in 1799, and this catalog was prepared by Franz Gleissner, and it is commonly known therefore as the Gleissner catalog, the so-called Gleissner Verzeichnis. You will also see a number 28 at the bottom. That's another Andre catalog number. So those things are not so important. You will then look and see number 1 at the top. Number 1 doesn't mean that the Kyrie is the first piece in the Mass. What it means is that when all of these manuscripts were put into packing crates and sent to Offenbach from Vienna, each one of the manuscripts was numbered. It was given an inventory, and this was number 1 in that particular packing crate. We see, as I mentioned yesterday, the idiosyncratic ordering of Mozart's score. The 2 violins on the first staves, then the violas, then 2 oboes, and they are marked by having a double G clef. A double G clef at the beginning tells the copyist that there are 2 separate parts there that are going to have to be copied separately. Under the 2 oboes are 2 horns in C, then 2 bassoons, and then there are trumpets in C. And he writes N timpani in C, but there is no staff for the timpani in C because there's no room on the page for it, because then there follow the chorus of canto alto, tenore, and bassi, and then on the bottom organ and bass. So he needs 13 lines for this, and he has only 12. What does he do? Let's have the next slide, please. This is the end of the Kyrie, and there is the timpani part on the right. You see, what happens is he creates what I will call an overflow score for those cases where he does not have enough staves to deal with. And this is something which has a great deal to do with the fate of this Mass. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is the beginning of the Quitolis from the Gloria. And if you look here, you will see that now there is a double chorus. So the first three lines are, as usual, the two violins and the violas. Then comes the coro primo, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Then comes the coro secondo, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and the organ and bass with its figuration. Because the choir takes up 8 of the 12 staves, and the strings take up the other 4, there is no room for any of the other instruments, forcing Mozart to notate a rather large overflow score. Could we have the next slide, please? Here is the overflow score to the Quitolis, and you see the oboes, the bassoons, the horns, and the trombones. Now, if you look very, very carefully, you will also notice that this is 10-stave paper and not 12-stave paper. 10-stave paper was generated in Salzburg. 12-stave paper was generated in Vienna. So it shows that Mozart did not notate the instruments in the overflow score until he had arrived with his wife in Salzburg. There's a criminological element in dealing with all of this, and it's, of course, what you don't notice that could really get you into a great deal of trouble. Now that you've seen this relationship, this uneasy relationship between 12-stave paper and 10-stave paper, Vienna versus Salzburg, and the chronology of notation, I can now go through what we have. What we have for Mozart complete is the complete Kyrie and the complete Gloria. The Gloria using, at times, overflow scores. Then we have draft scores of the first 2 movements of the Credo in Unum Deum and the Et Incarnatus Est. These pieces are fully drafted, meaning that the choral parts of the Credo and the vocal solo, the soprano of the Et Incarnatus Est is complete. The first violin part and the bass are complete. The second violin and the viola come and go. The winds, which have a concertino role in the Credo, are notated when they are playing concertino, but not when they're accompanying. And the rest of the instruments are not there at all. The chorus, of course, is there in its entirety. In the Et Incarnatus Est, the solo flute, the solo oboe, the solo bassoon are notated, as well as the soprano. The orchestral bass is notated all the way through, but the strings are notated only in the introduction and in the postlude. So those scores are complete in their conception, but incomplete in their orchestration. There is no trace in this basic draft score of anything after the Et Incarnatus Est, that is, from the Crucifixus to the Et Vitam Venturi. But then we have the Sanctus, Hosanna, and Benedictus. And in this particular case, the master score, the principal score containing the strings and the choir for the Sanctus and Hosanna disappeared. It probably was lost by the time Mozart left Salzburg for Vienna, never to return, because it was not part of his estate. What happened to it is a mystery. The only thing that survives of the Sanctus and Hosanna, and the repeat of the Hosanna fugue when the Benedictus is over, is the overflow score. So we have all of the wind and the brass, trombones, trumpets, horns, but we do not actually have the double choir or the strings in Mozart's handwriting. And we do not have an Agnus Dei, and we do not have a Dona Nobis Pacem. So there's quite a bit that's missing from this Mass. Now, it just so happened that when Mozart's father died, Mozart refused to come to Salzburg to order the estate, much to the anger of his sister Nannerl, who, perhaps in a gesture of revenge, decided to send all of the performing parts of Mozart's liturgical music to the monastery, the Abbey Church of Holy Cross in Augsburg, rather than sending them to her brother, which would have been the normal thing to do. His scores, his autograph scores, she sent to him, but not the parts. Hence, these parts turned up at Augsburg, where the choir master, who had heard Mozart improvise on the organ when the choir master was a little boy, started to score up these masses so that he could play them because he realized they were of high quality. And at one point he decided to score up the two main fugues, the Cum Sancto Spiritus fugue and the Hosanna fugue. And later on he decided to score up the entirety of the Mass. And because he had the parts, his version of the Sanctus and the Hosanna and all of the Benedictus has material that does not survive in Mozart's handwriting. However, unfortunately, he seems to have collapsed the double choir, with the exception of a few bars, into a single chorus. So the actual text of the double choir is a matter for speculation. What this means is there's a certain amount of the piece that was completed by Mozart and survives complete. There's a certain amount of music which Mozart completed, but which comes down to us incomplete and therefore needs to be reconstructed. There is a certain amount of the piece which Mozart drafted, but did not score up. That needs to be supplied with instrumentation. And finally, there's the vexing matter of the movements which are missing. Is there any way to know how many there are? And if you can determine this, is there material? How would you go about looking for it? Where might you find it? Now, I'm going to have to give sub-miniature presentation of all of this because, as you can see, it's a very, very complex series of issues. Let's start with the question of how many movements are missing in the credo. The fascinating thing about Mozart is that he reached basic structural strategies as a composer when he was a child, and he held on to them for the rest of his life. He wrote two grand masses when he was young, the so-called Dominicus Mass, K66, and the so-called Orphanage Mass, K139, which is also like the C minor Mass, a Mass in C minor whose later movements are in C major. I mean, one could more likely say that Bach wrote a D major Mass than a B minor Mass if you want to look at the statistical preponderance of one key as opposed to the other. And what is interesting is that the way that Mozart divides the text in the Gloria and in the Credo, in the Dominicus Mass and in the Orphanage Mass, is followed with exactitude in the C minor Mass to the extent that it survives. This enables us to say with reasonable certainty that what is missing from the Credo are the movements Crucifixus, one movement, et Resurrexit, one movement, et in Spiritum Sanctum, one movement, et in unam sanctum, one movement, and et vitam venturi. This we can predict. That there needs to be an Agnus Dei and a Dona Nobis Pacem is obvious. What I did when I decided to embark on this quixotic project was to scan every surviving sketch of anything that Mozart wrote from 1781 to 1785, which is the time in which he used this Italian text fitted to the Kyrie and the Gloria, and that represents, as you can see, the moment that he abandoned the idea of proceeding further with the C minor Mass. And I would suggest that the fact that Davide Penitente uses the music from the Kyrie and the Gloria, but not from the Sanctus, Hosanna, and Benedictus, would show and corroborate that he did not have his score to that in Vienna, that it was already lost. So I looked at all of these sketches, and I started to find some things. And I'd like to share some of those things with you. Could we please go to slide 15? Now, whereas the manuscript that I have shown you before is methodical and clean, it is a public handwriting, it is clear that this is anything but. This is private, sketched scribble. Nonetheless, if you look at it carefully, you will realize that he is writing for 8 voices and that this is a double fugue. The bottom is accompanied by Now, let's go on to the next slide, please, which is a diplomatic transcription of this, and it becomes a little bit easier for you to see. Now, if you start, again, criminologically to examine this sketch, a few things start to show up that are interesting. Notice that in the third bar, there is a slur over the first 3 crotchets of that bar. And also notice that in the previous bar, the two quavers have flags. This is a clear indication that Mozart had a particular text in mind, and that he needed to repeat the D with two quavers because he needed two syllables there, and he had three crotchets slurred because only one syllable would be accommodated by those three. And it doesn't take long to understand that the most likely text to that would be Crucifixus etiam pro nobis. Now, if that isn't convincing enough, consider the fact that the music paper on which that sketch is notated, it bears the same watermark as the Et Incarnatus Est, and it is in the same tint of ink. And since ink was purchased in small quantities and ran out rather quickly, it's clear that this sketch was written at the same time that Mozart was working on the Et Incarnatus Est, and since it was the next movement, it is the most likely thing for him to have sketched next. But it goes on from that. You will notice that the basic choral fugue on the bottom starts with the bass and rises to the tenor and the alto. The sketch breaks off before the soprano would come in. Meanwhile, in the counter subject, it starts at the top, then goes to the second to the top, and the third and the bottom. That forms a cross. Not only that, the subject, the counter subject in the top voice, starting at the end of the first line and going downwards, this kind of overlapping set of jumps is known in German as a cross motive because it literally replicates in musical tones the sign of the cross. So this was a very happy discovery. One is not always so lucky as this. Now, of course, getting a sketch of this kind, which is 12 bars, gives you a sense of how the piece begins, but it tells you very little about the architecture. And to contemplate what the architecture is going to be, you have to start to think a great deal about the attitudes, the theological attitudes towards the crucifixion, which vary a great deal in musical settings, and they vary a great deal in theological writings, because one looks upon the crucifixion as a gesture of mercy, but as a gesture of horror. There is anger, and there is sorrow. How is one going to reconcile these complex religious feelings in a single piece? This adds a great deal of challenge to the mere challenge of writing an 8-part fugue. Now, I'm going to hold off playing for you an example of what I did with this and ask instead that we go on to the next slide. And this is a characteristic grab bag slide of a Mozart sketch leaf, because you see at the top there is the beginning of a keyboard fugue, which is written in Mozart's clean handwriting. But then some theory information follows on the third and fourth staves with 5/3, 6/3, and 6/4. He's showing somebody the common chords and their inversions. And there is some exercise material there. And then there is a demonstration of tonics and dominants, which has nothing to do with anything practical in terms of his own composition. But then, in red, there is a very interesting sketch. So, a fugue in C minor. You're trying to complete the C minor Mass and you found a fugue in C minor. That would seem to be a very joyous day. The problem is that if you go through this prosody, you can't find a missing, unset text from the C minor Mass that fits this fugue. That's extremely depressing. But actually, the beginning of the counter subject does work very well for the very next movement that we need to deal with, which is Et Resurrexit. So one could salvage the fugue counter subject and use it as one of the bases for how we would go on. Could we have the next slide, please, which shows this in diplomatic transcription? And it goes on, as you see, it's quite an extended sketch. Now let's go on to the next slide, please. Now, this is a page from the draft of the Credo in Unum Deum movement. As you look at it, you will see that it documents my characterization of this as being drafted but not fully scored. As you see, the first violin runs right across the page and is complete. The second violin and viola staves are empty. In many cases, Mozart directs the seconds to play in unison with the first, but when he wishes that to happen, he will write unison, his abbreviation, US, at the beginning of the line. That is not here. You will see in the next lines coming down, the two oboe parts tootling along, the horn parts, and the bassoons. But then, after the first crotchet of the second bar, they are empty for the rest of the page, and that does not mean that they are not to play. It means that he has only written down the obligato function for them. And then we have the 5-part chorus here with 2 sopranos and the bass in the bottom. And what I find interesting here is this is the Latin phrase visibilium et invisibilium. Visible and invisible. And when he gets to the end in invisible, he creates a fugato. And I started to think about this. The resurrection was invisible. How about the possibility of combining the counter-subject from that fugue with this fugato material and deriving the et resurrexit from that, which, of course, ends, as you well know, with saying that both the dead and the living, actually the living and the dead, will be judged. So perhaps we might start by listening to what is actually a persiflage, if you like. It is wild speculation on how you could write a movement to the text et resurrexit based on these 2 little snippets of Mozartian material. This is track 14. Wait a minute, 1 second. No, it's 12. Track 12, please. And it will start with an augment. That's the motive in diminution. And he's ascending into the heavens. Upside down. Thank you. So you can see that this is a very odd admixture of a rigorous obsessive treatment of two motives found in Mozart and exploitation of their possibilities, diminution, augmentation, inversion, and so on, which would of course be familiar to any well-schooled church musician of this time. But in order for it to be integrable into the texture of a completed C minor Mass, of course, not only do these kinds of treatments have to be used, but the overall style has to be plausible. And that, of course, comes from a rather exhaustive examination of syntax. So we see here the idea that you're going to start a movement based on some material, some snippets of material that are genuine. Let us now go, if we can, to slide 20. And this is a very curious kind of document because, as you see, it is definitely in Mozart's handwriting, and it has soprano, alto, tenor, and bass with no text, and a continuo line. The continuo line is a little bit odd because it's highly polyphonic, and then it disintegrates, if you wish, into a series of minims, which is a bit odd. It has been suggested that this is not actually an idea of Mozart, but rather a copy by Mozart of an interesting passage of an unidentified piece by one of his contemporaries. But as we know, Mozart, like Bach, like Beethoven, often integrated mildly plagiarized music into their own compositions. And if he copied this, it was probably not just because it amused him, because he had such a prodigious memory that he could have easily committed it to memory without writing it down. And I looked at this, and in any case, here it is, a fascinating imitative passage which keeps on going down the circle of fifths. It starts in E minor on the dominant B major, and you'll notice what it does. Whoops, let's get this out of the way. Spectacular importance to someone thinking about the C minor Mass is that it ends on the dominant of C minor. This then, could we go to the next slide, please, which reproduces this in diplomatic copy. This seemed to be a piece of music that would be eminently usable, but it obviously, unlike the previous challenge, does not present the beginning of a piece to be spun out. It represents something that happens very late in the piece. And here you would have to derive a beginning. In order to find out exactly how late in the piece it was, or what sort of challenge had to be solved, the first thing we need to do is to figure out which text from the unset part of the Mass might fit to this. And the one that seemed to work the best is et expecto resurrectionem mortuorum. And I await the resurrection of the dead. It would also justify the use of the chromaticism that we find here too. Think about what happens in the Confiteor, at the end of the Confiteor of Bach's B minor Mass, where the resurrection of the dead is depicted in harrowing chromaticism before the text itself becomes transfigured and becomes joyous. So the segment of the Mass which Mozart would have used to include this, the et expecto, begins with a belief in a holy and apostolic church. So what was needed here was to deconstruct this highly tortuous chromatic passage into a diatonic version. And then, by degrees, the whole thing would become more and more complicated. So it occurred to me that the declaration of belief in the Holy and Apostolic Church should actually begin not polyphonically, but homophonically, simply reproducing an accompaniment of that melodic idea, which then could become a diatonic fugato, and that ultimately could culminate in the passage that we see here, which would then lead into the Et Vitam Venturi fugue. And before I actually play this, I want to say a word about the Et Vitam Venturi fugue. I went through these sketches. I don't have the time to tell you how I did every single one of these movements, but I was able to do the Agnus Dei and the Et in Spiritum Sanctum by looking at that cantata that Mozart concocted in 1785. He wrote 2 additional arias for that cantata. One of them involved the clarinet, which was not possible for the orchestration of the Mass, but the other has a slow introductory passage in C minor in 3/8, very tormented, and then a radiant, larger section in 4/4 in C major. The C major section seemed ideal for the Et in Spiritum Sanctum. I had to transpose it to G major because it needed to be a tenor aria. I could tell that from the orphanage Mass. But the opening with its anguish seemed absolutely ideal for the Agnus Dei. And so, by using the contrafactura principle in reverse, Mozart had set his Latin music to an Italian text. I was now going to take a Latin aria and set it to a Latin text, an Italian aria and set it to a Latin text. That proved to be workable. And there is a sketch for the Dona Nobis Pacem, which I'd like to show you right now. If we could have slide 24, please. This is a diplomatic transcription of one of 2 texts by Mozart that are connected with this motive. Next slide, please. Mozart writes Dona Nobis Pacem on this sketch, so there's no question about the fact that that's what he had in mind, and the C minor Mass was the only Mass that he was writing at this time. So this is clearly a scrap that has something to do with that. Many people have chastised me for using this idea because they say that it is rather celebratory and rather silly, and Mozart would never have ended a great Mass like this with such a serious case of the jollies. People who say that know very, very little about South German and Austrian church music because Haydn's Dona Nobis Pacem sections are regularly jubilant and represent kinds of depictions of peasant weddings. So I don't think that's an issue, besides which, if what I'm trying to do is to find legitimate Mozartian material to use, would I discard the sketch, forcing me to invent something of my own composition? That wouldn't seem to be very interesting. Now, if you look at the opening of this Dona Nobis Pacem, I just referred to this aria from Davide Penitente, which I used for the Agnus Dei, and the end of the slow section of that features the orchestra going. So, the connection between them motivically is so striking that the legitimacy of stringing them together seemed really to be a very lucky stroke. Now, I found all of these possible bits of material for all of the movements save one, and that was the Et Vitam Venturi. In the case of the Et Vitam Venturi, it was obvious that what I needed was a fugue. It's the locus classicus for such a fugue, and had to balance the Cum Sancto Spiritu fugue, which ended the Gloria. Just the way Christoph Wolff was the first person to observe that Mozart had plotted the structure of the Requiem so that each of the major sections was to end with a fugue. The Introitus with the Kyrie fugue, you see the sequence with the Amen fugue, which survives in a sketch but which Süssmayr did not use, the Offertory with the Quam Olim Abrahe fugue, the Sanctus with the Hosanna fugue, and the Communion with the, as Süssmayr did it, with the reiteration of the Kyrie fugue as the Cum Sanctis Tuis fugue. So here, it was very, very clear that what was needed was a fugue, but what was the subject to be? And I thought, the thing to do is to go through, from the very first movement of this Mass, look at polyphonic little bits that have possibilities for imitation and working out that Mozart did not exploit, intending to reserve it for later. And so I looked at the very first movement, the Kyrie, which, of course, when the chorus comes in with the common chord, then so this idea was not exploited, but simply presented as a counter-subject to the orchestras without any development. But then, as I parsed the rest of the piece, I was looking at the Domine Deus. Thousands of people could listen to that Mass 50 times and not notice that this is a double diminution of the original. What that means is that there's a step in the middle which is missing, which is twice as fast as the Kyrie, but half as fast as the Domine Deus. I had my subject. So I will propose to conclude this lecture by giving you another sample of this to show you then the et unam sanctam, seeing the deconstruction of this chromatic motive that I showed you before, and seeing how it leads into the Et Vitam Venturi fugue. That means that we need to start, please, at track 14. It's the one after that. I think that's track 13. I have 14, please. Now fugato. But diatonic. Bass has the tune. Now the soprano. Now we're ready for the quotation. You can go on. Oh, now you've gotten to the Benedictus. You need to go to track 50. That's it. Now it's time for some stretto. Thank you. Now, I think the point that needs to be made here is, of course, this is pure speculation. It's an air castle. It has absolutely no legitimacy whatsoever. But what it does is it allows the portion of the piece that Mozart composed to be heard in a complete liturgical context. And if, in fact, part of the church is made out of plywood instead of granite, it still allows those who listen to the piece as a totality to have a sense of what it might have been had Mozart actually completed it. If, in fact, it succeeds at that admittedly highly modest task, then all of the thousands of hours of torturous self-doubt may possibly have been worth it. In the meantime, thank you very much for accompanying me on this little journey, and if there's some questions, then perhaps I can entertain them. Thank you very much.